DC Pro Bono Week. DC Pro Bono Week is an annual celebration in line with the ABA's national celebration. This year, the ABA's national theme is supporting communities. And that's how we landed on the theme for this year's Hot Topics panel. Amazing. Welcome, Justin. Our Hot Topics panel allows us to have those important conversations that don't really fit into any other conversation that we're having throughout the week. And it also allows us to highlight what we think is really important for folks to take away from DC Pro Bono Week. So thank you all so much for joining us for movement lawyering and how to support grassroots efforts. All right, that is the long and the short of our housekeeping. I'm going to get us started on the program. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll hopefully answer them throughout. All right, I'm going to get us started off with introductions, starting with Mia.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Washington Council of Lawyers for having me, for hosting this conversation. My name is Nia Langley. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a staff attorney at Bread for the City, which is an organization that for over 50 years has provided free food, clothing, healthcare, medical care, legal services, and social services to DC residents. Our movement lawyering practice is couched under the housing group of our legal clinic, and so the work that I do is mostly in the housing justice context, with some direct representation for eviction defense and other housing related matters. Is that enough, Chris, or do I need to do more?
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Nia.
Great. Thank
And
you,
Brooke.
Chris.
Absolutely.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the Washington Council of Lawyers for having us here today. My name is Brooke Hill. I'm Senior Counsel in the Fair Housing and Community Development Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And the Lawyers Committee is a national civil rights organization. I guess you could call it a legacy civil rights organization. It was started in 1963, and we do a lot of different types of civil rights work, including, voters' rights, criminal legal system reform, and housing, where I work. And before law school, I was a community organizer with New York Acorn and then New York Communities for Change. And as an organizer, I worked with attorneys at the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and Brooklyn Legal Aid. And I think those experiences really inspired me to go to law school. And as a lawyer, a lot of my practice is focused on representing and collaborating with community-based organizations, movement groups, and organized groups of tenants. So I guess I'll pass it to Justin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Hansford. He, him pronouns. I'm a law professor at Howard University, the founder and executive director of our Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. And for the last 5 years, I've been the director of our movement lawyering clinic. And in the clinic, we teach students how to become movement lawyers, which we're going to talk about a lot today. And I know my experience with that is really something that grows out of my background as a lawyer connected to the Black Lives Matter movement. I was teaching at St. Louis University when Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014, and I became very involved with some of the legal work that people did in conjunction with those organizers in the 2010s and that controversy. And so I have been writing about movement lawyering ever since, and I'm really excited to have the conversation about it today.
Okay.
Hey, y'all. I'll echo the thanks, appreciation for hosting the panel today. For folks who are joining, I'm thrilled to be part of this. My name is Ellie Zweibel, he, him, his. I have my own firm, and I am legal director of the Transformative Justice Project of Colorado, organization that was formerly known as Colorado Juvenile Defender Center. I was a teacher before going to law school, and long story short, because I know we don't have all the time in the world today, I was sick of seeing my students getting funneled into the school to prison pipeline, and thought that the best way to advocate for them and their families was to get a JD. When I went to law school, I didn't necessarily know exactly what my practice would look like. And because of the various externships and folks with whom I studied throughout law school, I got hooked into movement lawyering. And specifically, a lot of the work I was doing with Advancement Project, based in DC, and not wanting to necessarily pick my lane when it came to, did I want to be a litigator? Did I want to work on policy? Did I want to continue with education? I kind of wanted to do all of the above, recognizing that the young people who are struggling against the school to prison pipeline needed folks who are willing to show up in all of those ways. And so, like I said, I have my own practice here in Denver, Colorado, where I do that work. I do that work pro bono through the nonprofit as well. And as I'm sure we'll talk about it through the rest of this session, I can provide more details about what all of that looks like.
Thank you so much, Ellie. All right, Justin, we're going to turn to you first for kind of some ground setting in this conversation. Let's first start by defining movement lawyering, and if you could give some examples of how it differs from traditional lawyering for folks who maybe have heard of it before but don't have a good sense of what it actually means.
All right, happy to. It's a interesting conversation. Some people will say there are differing interpretations on the specifics of what falls under the umbrella of movement lawyering. In general, one the hallmarks of movement lawyering that I use when I teach it to my students is I say that we look at movement lawyering as a process of engaging in integrated advocacy techniques to support I call them mobilized clients. So if we break that down, our clients usually, as attorneys working in the pro bono space, we think of vulnerable individuals who are being, in a place where they could use our support. But with movement lawyering, it's a movement. So that's not just a nonprofit organization. Usually we're talking about a coalition of organizations, and we're talking about, very importantly, campaigns. So these are groups that are part of campaigns that are seeking to create significant change, and they would be then looking for you to do work that goes beyond litigation. Most movement lawyers will tell you that their work goes beyond the courtroom. In fact, there was a book that I was part of on movement lawyering called "The Revolution Will Not Be Litigated." So it's about the idea that you're finding ways to be an advocate that go beyond traditional litigation strategies, but still using your legal tool set. And the goal there is now going to be translated into the context of trying to build power for that movement, to build power for that campaign. So power building is an essential element of the movement lawyer's lens. When I teach it to my students, I break it down into 4 elements. I say that we need to understand how to create narratives and do storytelling in a way that uplifts the questions of justice involved in the campaign. You need to understand power dynamics to really empower your client. Maybe that involves power mapping. Maybe that involves finding other ways to leverage the tools and assets that the campaign has. And understanding that your role is really number 3, you're part organizer, part lawyer. I say you're doing organizing work in addition to doing uh, lawyering work. And so one of these key questions is, as a movement lawyer, how is your lawyering different from a non-movement lawyer's? And one of the main ways it's different is that having one foot in the organizing space, understanding power dynamics, understanding storytelling in a certain way, you're looking at your legal work as part of a broader strategy. Oftentimes, it's not the only strategy involved in a campaign strategy, and it's not even oftentimes the central part of the campaign, but it's an important part, and you're aware of the role that it plays. And So with that, I also, number four, I say we also have radical imagination that we use as movement lawyers, I want us to always think about pushing the envelope and understanding that we're going beyond the traditional boundaries that are set out often in the legal practice. And part of that is because we're taking the lead of the campaign. We follow the lead of the organizers. We're letting the organizers be the ones in the front who are really calling the shots, and we're supporting from behind with our legal tool set. So we follow the organizers' radical visions, and we try to help to learn how to say yes. So many times as lawyers, it seems like our job is saying no to clients when we counsel them. But in this movement lawyering space, we're trying to get to yes, so that we can find ways to empower them to reach their goals.
Thank you so much, Justin. That's a fantastic breakdown. I feel like everyone just got a little bit of the movement lawyering clinic from Howard without even having to attend. So that's incredible. But definitely check out the resources that Howard has to learn more there for sure. But I want to bring it to the community, Nia, if I can, and maybe talk through some uh, practical explanation or giving some identifying what are some of the current needs in the community and kind of what does that look like from a movement lawyer.
That's a big question, Chris. Some of the things that immediately come to mind are that we're in the third week of a federal shutdown that, to be clear, impacts all of us to varying degrees. ICE is disappearing U.S. residents all over the country, including in the district. DC specifically is under a military occupation. It's all very Orwellian and scary. And right now, what we need is resistance. We need mutual aid. We need organizers, and we need lawyers of all disciplines to, provide direct representation to some people, to support organizing, and, pushing back against these attacks on our democracy and our people. In the context in which I work, in DC and in the housing space, the DC Council last month just passed a really colossal bill that will devastate tenants' rights and protections when it goes into effect. Um, Rights that were gained after over like 50 years of tenant-led organizing and legal advocacy. And all of that will mostly be undone. It's a big bill with a lot of issues, but the way it comes up in my work includes evictions. Evictions in DC will be sharply increased, it will be faster to evict people, and tenant protections will be, and defenses that would be otherwise available to them in court will be gone. Right now, DC residents, 60% of those residents are renters. About 200 cases a day, eviction cases a day are filed right now. And so for evictions to be sped up, it's going to mean that people are going to lose their housing. People are going to lose their housing subsidies if they have them. And when you lose your housing, you lose your ability to be stable. It's like the bedrock of your stability and your ability to thrive. And that's going to be really bad in a city where, it's really expensive to live in DC. Native Washingtonians are getting pushed out. And, there isn't a current way or DC in general is not adequately meeting the need of the unhoused population. There aren't new homeless shelters or other resources to that end. And so more people are going to be made vulnerable and are already vulnerable, but that's going to speed up. Also, in terms of my work, in terms of like more of the organizing stuff and less of the direct representation things that I do, on the movement lawyering side, more of like my clients, community members that I meet, organizers and partners that I meet are organizing around housing conditions. We have the right to live in clean, safe, livable housing. And overwhelmingly across the district in all 8 wards, people are living in really deplorable conditions. I've seen black mold. I met an elderly woman who didn't have a stove or oven in her house for over a year. Places were like 3 feet of standing water at the bottom of the building. It's like really bad. And so people are organizing to enforce their right to have clean, safe, livable housing, to demand that landlords are accountable, that they do what they're legally already obligated to do, which is to provide clean and livable housing. And so what we need in this moment, on top of, all the other stuff that were happening in the housing space, what I think about are lawyers who are, one, willing to provide direct representation to folks. Most of the tenants that face eviction are pro se or unrepresented. But also lawyers who are able to lend their time and their resources and skills toward organizing, and the people who are organizing. There's a need for it, but there just isn't capacity overall. So whether that looks like helping a tenants association in their demands, helping other organizers or community members who are trying to think of the legal ways, like litigious ways or other ways that they could strategize to get more power with tenants, I think that is, one of many things that could be helpful in this moment for DC specifically.
I really appreciate that, Nia. And I want to open it up to the other panelists if there's anything that you feel is important to highlight now about needs you're seeing throughout the community. And Brooke, there was something that we talked about in our planning call about being more willing to take on those affirmative cases. Could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, sure. And I think that Neo was just was getting at that, maybe not quite so directly. But with in terms of these tenants associations that are organizing around conditions in their building, or who are experiencing interference with their organizing activities. The District of Columbia, Rental Act notwithstanding, has very strong laws that protect the tenant's right to organize, and also, that the Consumer Protection Procedures Act could be used as, a very, it could be used effectively against landlords who neglect their like maintenance obligations. And it has been, used by the Attorney General and the Washington Lawyers Committee and some others, but more lawyers who can actually bring those cases to, enforce the tenant right to organize, and who can, hold landlords accountable for allowing properties to fall into disrepair uh, is necessary at this particular moment.
Thank you so much for that breakdown, Brooke. I think that that makes a lot of sense, and I think it puts part of our conversation in scope where we're kind of thinking about eviction defense cases on an individual basis, but then taking it a step back and saying, why are all these eviction defense cases happening? How can we support tenants in mass so that they don't face these kinds of fraught litigation? I think is core to the movement lowering goals. And Brooke, I'm turning back to you, and I would love to hear more about how folks can tune into the voices of leadership throughout the community. We know that movement lawyering, we should be putting those leaders at the forefront, and we're talking about radical imagination and saying yes to our clients. How do we go about hearing those voices? How do we go about saying yes to them?
Absolutely. And I think that the best way for me to answer that question is just to briefly describe the way that I went about it when I came to the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. I'm at the National Lawyers Committee now, but this is, some time ago. And essentially, what you want to do is you want to get involved with community-based organizations that are doing the type of work that you're interested in, or movement-based organizations, what have you, mobilized people. And when I started working at the Washington Lawyers Committee, I asked myself, like, how can the committee further the needs of some of these housing organizing campaigns? And then I had to ask myself another question, like, what are these housing organizing campaigns? So I started to, ask people about community groups, working on housing issues. I, searched the website newspapers and things like that, to just kind of get a lay of the land. I joined both 1DC and the DC NAACP and became an active member as a way of connecting with those organizations and sort of tuning into the work that they were doing, trying to understand. I also formed a professional relationship with Empower DC as a way to connect with that organization and their work. Um, Yeah, and I also did a lot of just informational meetings with really every group that I could think of that was doing housing justice work, both, legal services providers, but also non-legal service providers, folks like, the Latino Economic Development Center, housing counseling services. I talked to a lot of folks. And eventually this networking started to pay off, I guess you could say. I 1DC reached out to the Washington Lawyers Committee and asked us to join a coalition of uh, attorneys and organizers who were gearing up to resist the redevelopment of Brooklyn Manor, which is a large apartment development on about Rhode Island and Montana, or Brentwood Road, I think is the other end. And So we had the Washington Lawyers Committee in Covington and Burling. We brought a fair housing lawsuit. The Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, helped the Tenants Association with challenging the zoning PUD, the planned unit development application. 1DC and Howard University's Fair Housing Clinic helped the Tenants Association with like organizing. They held an election and sort of really tightening up their Tenants Association. They also held some clinics with Howard on the property. And that was, really because of, sort of the work that, not only, as I was reaching out, other folks, at 1DC and Empower DC and even the other legal service providers were sort of reaching back to form that coalition. And the Washington Lawyers Committee also got involved with, representing Empower DC and the Berry Farm Tenants and Allies, both in a fair housing case, but then, this is about taking direction from an example of taking direction from organizers and tenants. The Washington Lawyers Committee is an impact litigation, civil rights, organization. They don't necessarily do historic preservation work, but they didn't have another lawyer, and the tenants and the organizers made a really compelling case to us that like, hey, this is like a super historic property and somebody should like do something to try to preserve it. So we did work with them and some DC historians on putting together a petition for the Historic Preservation Society. And you know what? It was successful. I mean, it didn't win housing for the tenants, but they were able to require, some, preservation. There's going to be a museum. And I think that it's served as a way for folks to continue organizing around that issue. And so, we'll see if when the property is redeveloped, if it helps people to actually be in contact so they can try to, enforce, whatever right to return they have. But, and these relationships also allowed, over time, they allowed me to sort of evolve the Washington Lawyers Committee's housing justice practice beyond just a Fair Housing Act, straight kind of like up and down civil rights practice. And we got into doing some tenant right to organize cases and some Consumer Protection Procedures Act cases, because, like I said before, there's a huge need for people to do those cases, and they weren't doing them. So we, got in there and did a handful of them while I was, at the committee. And that was directly, the reason that we started to do that was because that's what we were hearing from the organizers. We're like, how can we help? And they're like, this is how you can help. And so I went back into the leadership and I was like, these are the cases that we need to bring, because the organizers said that this is how we can help. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much. And I think that your examples really showcase the fact that there are people at the heart of all of these movements, and getting connected to the organizations that have these movements as a part of their mission, I think is a great way to start getting connected to those people and to help understand their priorities. Um, Again, because part of being a movement lawyer is representing or being a part of a movement. And so sometimes being that lawyer is not being the most important person in the room, but making sure you're collecting the most important and vital information when legal action needs to happen. So thank you so much, Brooke. I think that's so enlightening. Um, and I want to turn now to Ellie and ask, um, what does it mean to think of your case not necessarily as an individual matter, but rather as a larger campaign? You're hearing about tenants cases and working with tenants associations and things of that nature. But how do we really get into that perspective of this is not just going to landlord tenant court and ensuring, my client doesn't get evicted, but maybe this is how my client's eviction case fits into the larger narrative.
Yeah, thank you. I think something I always remind myself of, whether it's in a discrete case, it's in, a larger campaign, is the mantra of a movement lawyer should be high impact, low ego, right? And that's coursing through a lot of what people are talking about so far today, in the session, right? It's not so much that we want to elevate the voices of those who are impacted by the policies or the issue that we're attacking. It's that, like lawyers, right? We want to get out of the way. Um, the people who are the leaders exist already. They don't need the lawyer to show up and be the leader. They don't need us to show up and dictate what comes next. Absolutely, per what Brooke was just talking about, like there are certain movements that are hungry for a lawyer so that whether it's litigation or even just the legal lens that we're trained to have is applied to the issue or the approach that they're taking. But a lot of the times, in my experience, we're warm bodies in the room supporting other folks' efforts, right? So to directly answer the question, that was just something stewing in my head from listening to Brooke. I think a lot of the work that I do is about longitudinal impact, right? It takes, and this is also something that Brooke was talking about, it takes cultivation of relationship with the folks who are living this day in and day out, living the school to prison pipeline day in and day out, who are fighting the school to prison pipeline from a non-legal lens day in and day out, whether that's the students who are impacted, their families, educators, mental health care providers, whomever it is, cultivating those relationships to establish trust, and really get an understanding over the course of a long period of time. What are the issues that keep coming up over time? And how does this one individual case where maybe I'm called in to defend a student against an expulsion, what are the issues in that individual case where I'm doing an adequate job as their attorney? I'm a competent attorney for that individual discrete representation, but what are the issues that I can raise that are going to tie back to those larger systemic issues that have been identified by the movement as something they want to tackle? Maybe, I mean, in Colorado, we have a law on the books that allow for students to be expelled for behavior on or off school property that's detrimental to the safety and welfare of students, staff, or the school itself. For obvious reasons, it's so vague, and it's clearly unconstitutional. And this is me applying my legal training to understanding that. But practically speaking, what the students and families are experiencing is that literally anything that these students engage in can be considered behavior off school property that's detrimental to the safety, or quote unquote welfare of other students or staff, right? Post something on social media, and that can be considered detrimental to the welfare of other students. And so there are many constitutional arguments I can raise in a discrete case, but how am I constantly tying that back to the overarching goal of tackling changing this law, changing how this law is implemented? The law itself is a self-sustaining power structure, right? It's written by people who have a vested interest in keeping their power. And per what Justin Hansford was talking about earlier, what Professor Hansford was talking about, like movement lawyering is about taking that power back. And I think I would call everybody who's tuning into this discussion today to engage with that sort of meta question of, we are lawyers or law students or legal service providers. And so to what extent are we buying into the system as we're trying to fight the system itself, right? And reminding us all of the Audre Lorde quote, right, about that, and how problematic that can be. And so, I flag that just to give folks the understanding, or at least to just flag it for folks, that there won't be any clean answers here and now that are going to apply throughout the practice of movement lawyering. It is a constant struggle and a constant questioning that we have to engage with ourselves and with other folks in the movement, with other lawyers who are engaging in movement lawyering. How are we showing up? How is what we're doing in this individual case relating to the larger movement work? And are we succeeding in that way? And to that point, if I can, I saw the question from the anonymous attendee: how do you quantify the effectiveness of movement lawyering? My answer would be, to answer this, I would shift the word quantify, because I think a lot of the time when we play the numbers game, because law is a self-sustaining power structure that's not built to work with the people that we are trying to help, that's just a colonial impact. That's if we're looking at the numbers, and a lot of the time the law is not built in such a way for us to get those numbers in a successful metric, right? And so I think instead of quantifying the effectiveness of a movement, I would say qualify. How do we qualify the effectiveness of movement lawyering, right? Are we succeeding in ensuring that folks who are marginalized, disenfranchised, actually feel empowered, actually feel like they have a voice in their own lives, and in the future for themselves, for their kids, for their families? And so I would just encourage that shift in thinking to get it to a qualify. Honestly, Chris, I'm not sure I fully answered the question, but that was what I'm bringing to the table.
That was perfect. And I do think that it answered our question in looking at, how do we think about a larger campaign? I think the way that you emphasize, you're going to have to be fully present and be a good lawyer to your individual client. But when you're looking at, what are the policies that are impacting this person, and how are my arguments in this individual case going to impact larger policy discussions, larger issues on that level, I think that is a fantastic framework for understanding, how to camp your individual client into the larger structure. And kind of getting at to the quantifying, qualifying, looking at how to think about movement lawyering in terms of, how can I do it successfully? I'm gonna ask everybody to answer this question. I'll go one by one, but I wanted to hear more about your perspective on how folks can navigate building a successful movement lawyering toolkit. So even if it's just one example of a tool that you keep in your belt that helps you to think about, how can I be a lawyer not just for this client but for my community? I think that would be helpful. And I'm going to start with Professor Hans.
Right. Well, that's a great question. I would say, if I just reflect on some of the practices that we've done in the movement lawyering clinic, one of the first things to think about is, what is there a movement connected to your case? So Brooke, Nia just talked about their work in housing justice, and so they have cases that come before them, maybe involving a tenant's rights, a particular tenant. You have a particular tenant association. You have a particular community development campaign, but there's also a national housing justice movement. I think this called Housing for All. There's one in the country that's called Housing for All. There's actually an international housing justice movement, but we know that there are particular people around the world and around the country who are part of that. And there are books on housing inequality, and there's literature, and there's research, and there are scholars in the field, and there are people. So there is a movement there, right? And so being immersed in that literature, being immersed in that organizing, understanding what's happening in all those different places enriches your practice and your individual case with your individual tenant association. So when you take on a pro bono case, there's a big difference between a lawyer who, even a diligent lawyer, who is very dutiful in seeking to do their work effectively, and the lawyer who is actually immersed in the literature and the books and the history and the scholarship and the commentary on the issue writ large. And being willing to bring that to your individual movement lawyering case is a big add-on. And some of the ways it plays out, I know some of our clients will say, well, you're helping us with, for example, a issue of, we have these gang databases in Washington, D.C., and many people are exploring the ways that surveillance is getting out of hand. And so there are campaigns against gang databases in Chicago and Boston and all these other cities. And because we have that national lens looking at the entire nation's movement, we can look at those other local campaigns and then help our campaign here in DC to explore what legal options have been effective, what legal options have not been effective, what know your rights literature has been effective, what has not been effective. And we can actually help to improve their campaign. And that's doing something outside of the courtroom, but still that still involves our understanding of legal techniques. And of course, thinking about this, school to prison pipeline, which these are we are seeing our individual pro bono cases not as pro bono cases anymore. We're seeing them as movements. And so we're immersing ourselves in those movements. And now that's how you also then begin to build trust with your clients, because they understand, oh, this isn't just a hired gun. This isn't just a person who's just here for this, to get their pro bono hours and then they're gone. No, this is a person who is a fellow traveler who actually cares about everything that's happening and the people that are involved in this campaign and this movement. And so now the communication becomes different. So to me, those are some of the fundamentals that have been helpful for my practice.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanford. That's a fantastic late overview. Nia, I'd love to hear some more about your tools you use.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Justin, in terms of like being immersed really informs. Like part of the thing about movement learning is that it is praxis. It is both theory and practice, and they edify each other. And so like when you're in the scholarship, in the readings, that informs how you practice. And certainly like when you're involved on the ground, that informs how you may approach a case that may be obviously like something tied to an organizing movement or campaign or something specific to an individual case. An example I have is that I did some eviction defense work at a building and I was representing several tenants who happened to be all part, well, not happened to be, it was an intentional thing. They were all part of a subgroup of a tenant union at this property. And because I was not just the lawyer for these individual tenants, but also actively engaged with the people in this tenant union and hearing their goals and how they wanted to approach their cases. Obviously not breaking any attorney-client privilege, but also thinking through like legal education with them, what strategy they could do, what did they want to accomplish. I was able to be cued in to the context of what was happening in this building in a way that other lawyers who were also at this building representing tenants did not have the knowledge that I had, just because they weren't tapped in. And it wasn't a fault of theirs. They didn't do anything wrong. They were, I imagine, diligent attorneys and doing the best they could with the cases that they had. But I just had a different lens and also a different approach to how I was doing the work, in part because I was informed by things that were outside of the universe of the case, and it helped inform like how I wanted to move forward in the case, and how, more importantly, the tenant I was working with, the tenants I were working with wanted to move forward. And some of that stuff was informed by the organizing that had nothing to do with me at all, and some things that I was there with. So all of it comes to play like when you're really engaged with things. I think about what Brooke said earlier about tapping into community and making sure like the organizations or the people who are doing stuff that you're interested in, you tap into those folks and those organizations. When I came to movement learning because I was introduced to it in law school, and it really spoke to the kind of lawyer I wanted to be. I have a mother who is a labor organizer, and I worked with, other organizers and met a lot of organizers and lawyers who worked with organizers. And I was like, how are you different from, other lawyers who care, other lawyers who are doing social justice, other lawyers who are doing things that maybe are in furtherance of a movement, but aren't necessarily movement lawyering. And it greatly informed how I move through the work. One thing that I think about when I'm like assessing like whether I or our practice can take on cases or support people with our movement learning practice and like whatever like services we could provide is whether they're asking for something that would lead to transformative change. And the way we think about transformative change at Bread is about like, does it change the material conditions of people's lives? Does it affirm people's individual sense of their own power? We don't empower anybody. They have the power already. Does it affirm or, increase their sense of their own power? And then does it change power dynamics? Does it, shift community power, increase community power? Because there's a lot of like transactional stuff that goes on, even community, focused things that doesn't really change any power dynamics, that is still overwhelmingly led by lawyers and not the community members. So those are some of the things I think about in terms of approaching a project, and also how I'm accountable to that and to the people that I'm working with um, in a movement lawyering context.
Thank you so much, Nia. That is incredible. And to be mindful of time, I am now going to turn our question of success stories to Brooke and to Ellie. So I'm going to start with Ellie. Could you provide just an example of a success story that you think really encapsulates parts of your movement practice?
Yeah. Um, so again, I'll bring it back to school to prison pipeline work out here in Colorado. Until just a couple of years ago, the quote unquote neutral, hearing officers who would oversee expulsion hearings in our state, there were no requirements on who that could be, if they had any training, what background, none of that. There was nothing. And there was no issues when there were conflicts of interest or clear bias. And so for an anecdotal example, I'd shown up to hearings where the lead witness against my client was the superintendent of the school district, who also was the hearing officer making the recommendation to the superintendent, i.e. himself, on whether to expel or not. And this was totally okay in the law. That was one anecdote, but similar issues were popping up all over the state. Again, long story short, because I want to be mindful of time, over the course of 2 years, and sustained litigation, community meetings once a week, and then putting together policy language that was mostly written by young people and their families, as well as the teachers who were directly impacted by these conflict of interest issues, as well as, a slew of other school to prison pipeline policies that we don't have to get into here. A group put together of 30 some odd organizations, agencies, plus a couple of schools and student bodies put together a bill and ran it here in Colorado. There was 5 hours of committee testimony in front of our House Education Committee. 4.5 of those hours was put on by the students themselves. 70 students showed up to testify to House representatives in the State House of Colorado. And it was incredible. They wrote their own testimony, and got feedback from some adults in the group in the movement, on like, here's where we think you should emphasize, or like, hammer this, talk more slowly, that sort of feedback. All young people between the ages of 14 to 18 years old. And I mean, talk about like a powerful experience. I mean, the adults in the room who cared about kids, like tears in our eyes, right? Here were kids speaking their truth to power. And the bill ultimately passed and is now signed into law. And again, the kids were the bulk of the testimony. They were the bulk of the driving force. They're the ones who are impacted by these issues. And I have no doubt that we're going to be back in the Colorado legislature in the not too distant future with more kids who are saying we need to change and this system is not working for us. So I think, talking a bit about what my role in that was, I mentioned it a little bit there, right? I was another adult in the room saying like, hey, here's the point in the law that we're attacking. What do you have to say about that? Or let me give you some feedback on your testimony, help you cut it down from 3 minutes to 2 minutes. And boy, howdy, I mean, when you talk about the skill set that movement lawyers need to get, I mean, it's going to be unconventional stuff that we don't learn in law school, right? So like organizing a spreadsheet, right? Figuring out the order that these kids were going to testify, right? I mean, it's things like that, and really placing on the shelf my ego about like what is my training. No doubt. I mean, being good at the litigation that I'm trained to do, absolutely have to be that. But in those moments where I am there in a supporting role for these kids to be the agents of their own lives and their own futures, my ability to litigate is pretty relevant, but my ability to show up and support them, to help them organize their what they have to say, that is valuable. That's a valuable skill set. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I love that you hit a success story and provided the tools you used. Brooke, if you're able, I'd love to hear a success story from your perspective with some of the tools you used to gain that success.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this success story that I'm about to talk about, it highlights, two really important things that I think, when you're thinking about movement lawyering are critical. And that is that the legal action has to be connected to the organizing. Now, when I say connected, it doesn't need to be like step one, step two, step three, although kind of, but you have to know what's going on with the organizing, and the organizing has to know what's going on with you, and there has to be some sort of like, conduit of communication and alignment, right? And then there actually has to be organizing that's happening beyond just the legal case, right? Um, just to like, I'm going to tell you about a success story, but I'll tell you about a story that wasn't successful that I recently experienced, at the Lawyers Committee. And there we had one of our, community organizing partners. They brought us, this fact pattern from this property that sounded horrible. And they were like, we were out there, signing up the tenants as members, and they were like, they really need a lawyer. And so they were like, can you come talk to him? And we're like, okay, we'll talk to him. We'll figure out what's going on. See if there's something we can do. No promises, always no promises, right? And so we went out there, or we didn't actually go. We had a Zoom call with the folks, and we talked to them, and then we tried to like follow up with the tenants, and it was getting hard. And the organizers were like, well, we haven't really talked to the tenant leaders because they told us, after the meeting with the lawyers, they're just basically interested. They want to do the legal case and not the organizing. So we were like, sorry, there was a misunderstanding here. If there's no organizing, then we actually have limited resources as an organization, and we have to like reallocate our resources towards, tenants who are mobilized and involved in organizing that goes beyond just the legal case, right? So we actually had to pass on that case because the tenants had decided they weren't going to organize with this organizing group. They were just going to try to bring a lawsuit. So we were like, we wish you genuinely the best of luck, but we have to like make choices about how we allocate our resources. So it's really important to us to be working with mobilized groups of people, not just, people who are like, a horrible thing has happened to me, come save me. Because, this justice system isn't built to save you. So I can't, and I'm not a musician. Um, so, um, so the success story involves a case that I think you can just Google it, Meridian Heights, in Columbia Heights in DC. This was a case where the Washington Lawyers Committee and Proskauer Rose represented the Tenants Association and a class of tenants in a case, dealing with violations of the Consumer Protection Procedures Act, maintenance issues, and then interference with the tenant right to organize. And, it had a good outcome. Ultimately, this is a small building, less than 50 units. And ultimately the class settlement was like 2.2 million. So when you're talking about, that small of a class, that's actually, a decent, I would say they might have been entitled to more, but that's me. I call it a success story. They thought it was a success story, and that's the most important thing, right? So, and the biggest key to success in this case was how engaged and organized the tenants were. They had a meeting every Monday night. This building had like 40, 45 units occupied. They would have over 20 people in the lobby every single Monday at 5:30. And so Nia, and maybe Justin, anybody who does building organizing, you know that if you have a building that's 50 units, if you got like 8 people in the lobby, that's an activated building. That's a big, but to have like 25 people in the lobby week in and week out, and they had their own meeting, right? They were like, okay, y'all got 15 minutes on the agenda, but you don't get to go first. So, so we would go like, midway through the meeting, and then they would be like, okay, so we'll call you then. And we would be like, okay, sounds good. But like we would come every Monday for our 15 minutes to give them their update. And in that way we stayed, connected to the organizing, and they actually had real organizing happening, right? And so then they were able to be like, when the settlement offer came in or whatever, they were able to be like, okay, so we're going to go take it to the group. And they ended up having some long tenants association meetings, but they were organized. They knew what they wanted. We were one piece of their plan, because they were litigating. They had another lawyer for TOPA, so they were like, messing around with the owner's TOPA situation. They were doing protests. They were calling 311 to have inspections on the building done. They had a whole strategy, right? And we as lawyers were one piece of their strategy. And that was like really important for me, that we were not their whole bag, right? We were just one of the things they were working on. And I think that's really important as a movement lawyer. You don't want to get in a situation where they're like, oh, okay, now we can stop organizing because Justin has arrived. He's gonna fix everything. Because that is just, like we said at the beginning of this, or I think it might have been Ellie, one of us said that, these laws aren't built to help, working class, everyday people. They're built, they're designed by the people in power in order to keep power. So you have to have a multi-pronged approach if you're going to sort of loosen up those power dynamics.
Thank you so much, Brooke. And thank you to everyone. This has been such an insightful conversation. Extend my greatest appreciation, not only for how much you're sharing and the learning that we're doing together, but the work that you're doing every single day. I am now going to turn to our questions from the audience. We have just about 3 minutes left. So, hopefully we'll get through them. But again, if you have any questions, we'll share folks' contact in the follow-up email and things of that nature. So asking as a representative of a movement, where should grassroots movements seek legal representation? And this person's looking for something that's not something in active litigation, but maybe trying to get some insight into that, building legal strategy. And I see Justin's answering us in the chat, so maybe I'll open up to Ellie or Brooke or Nia if there's anything that you'd like to add in that. Nia, you look like you want to say something.
It's hard because, there are a lot of lawyers or organizations out there that like the question articulated won't really get involved unless there's active litigation. I think if you're doing housing stuff, you could try to reach out to Brad for the city and see if there's something we can help you with. But if not, I would just still inquire about, I think legal service providers are a helpful place to start, at least maybe civil rights places like the Washington Lawyers Committee, Howard University Movement Lawyering Clinic. I know they do a lot. They have a breadth of practice areas, which is also great. Like movement lawyering is not specific to one area of law. And so I hope that's semi-helpful. But I think also one thing that we have stressed in this conversation so far is just to make sure that the organizing is really tight, because what can happen especially if you get with the wrong lawyer, and I don't want to use that to say that they're doing anything wrong, but lawyers tend to kill off groups or harm organizing and do more harm when the organizing isn't strong, because the lawyers come in and the power dynamics change. Then and it would have been more helpful maybe if the organizing just continued on without a lawyer. But to the extent you are looking for some, I would start with like the legal service providers in your area and maybe some civil rights organization. And feel free to contact Brett for the city if it's a housing thing.
I would add law schools. I mean, but you already kind of said Howard, but really, I think even in some of the other like less resource rich places, like in DC, you've got civil rights organizations, legal services organizations, law schools. You have sort of the plethora of options, but in some of the other like other places where you have fewer options, law school clinics and things like that can be good places to look. And also national alliances, right? You know, there's strength in numbers. It's why you organize in the first place, right? So why not just reach beyond the city and, you know, see what they're doing in Baltimore about that legal question, you know, because they might be able to be like, we talked to this dude and he's trash. But this woman over here, she's got it, you know, she's got it figured out and she's going to listen to you. So you should make that call. And so that's what I would say is, you know, reach out to, you know, other folks doing similar work in other places and see how what they're doing. And then also law schools.
And sometimes, sorry, Chris, sometimes that can apply like cross disciplines. So like I was working with some organizers who wanted to apply the participatory defense community organizing model that comes from Silicon Valley Debug in the Bay Area in the criminal legal context and get trained up by them and then apply what they could to the DC eviction context. And our movement lawyering team was part of that. We were part of like training that up and forming participatory defense hubs, which turned into like community leaders leading those hubs and people being able to find community and also had better outcomes in their cases. Most of these people, all of these people were unrepresented. The meetings were lawyer-free spaces intentionally. And then they also made participatory action hubs or offense hubs. So they weren't just on the defense, but they were able to like learn from other places around the country, including a different context entirely, a criminal legal system to apply to a housing context. So, you know, look around, like Brooke said, and it doesn't have to be specific to the issue you're doing, but you can apply a lot of things to your specific situation in organizing and campaign.
Thank you, Nia. And Justin, I see if there's anything you'd like to add.
No, I think what was said is perfect. I think that you know, we have a movement lawyering clinic at Cornell as well as Howard and Duke. You know, so that is a process I would like to see expanded. I'd actually would like to see movement lawyering clinics in law schools around the country. You know, so it's a growing movement that we're trying to develop. And then I would say that on the other side of the coin, if you're a lawyer working on pro bono cases, make sure you reach out to grassroots organizations working on the issue that you're involved in, because it goes, I guess you could say it goes both ways. You know, the relationships oftentimes could be built by the lawyers on the case, taking the initiative to try to bring in existing campaigns. Campaigns may not know about everything that's happening locally, and you can in some ways build new connections.
Thank you all so much. And thank you everyone who joined us this afternoon. I'm going to take a quick moment to just a round of applause for our incredible panelists for sharing their incredible knowledge with us. It's been wonderful to spend the afternoon with everybody. One event that I absolutely want to plug in this space, I'm going to just drop the link really quick in the chat, is the landlord tenant branch at the DC Superior is having an open house tomorrow where you can go with Sylvia Soltis and folks from the Legal Aid DC to do a tour of the DC landlord tenant branch and learn about how to get involved at a pro bono level. So, you know, we've heard a lot about housing rights and tenant support, and that's a fantastic way to get connected to folks who really need your help. So I highly recommend the landlord tenant court tour. You also get a chance to meet with judges. So if you've never been to the landlord tenant court here in DC, if you've never met a landlord-tenant judge, this is a fantastic way to get into the community and to do that, because those folks will tell you exactly what they're thinking when they're sitting on the bench, and it'll help to inform how you are going to practice before them. Again, thank you all so much for being a part of this incredible event. We saw that there were some like books and other materials that were shared in the chat. We will also share those in the follow-up email. So if you didn't write them down, do not worry. You will get access to them. And we hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day today. And we hope to see you at other DC Pro Bono Week events throughout the week, including the Walk for Justice on Thursday, and in getting more access to justice, resources to the folks that need it here in DC.